The gray wolf shouldn't have been there. Gideon Pratt had owned this isolated mountain ranch for 8 years, and he'd never seen a wolf this close to his property. The animal limped badly, favoring its left hind leg as it approached his water trough in the pre-dawn darkness. Blood matted its thick winter coat, but what struck Gideon most was the creature's behavior. It drank slowly, methodically, as if this was routine rather than desperation. For 3 consecutive mornings, the same scene repeated. The wolf would emerge from the pine forest, drink from his trough, then disappear back into the wilderness toward the rocky cliffs that bordered his land. Each time, Gideon watched from his cabin window, rifle ready but unused. Something about the animal's deliberate movements suggested intelligence beyond mere survival instinct. On the 4th morning, Gideon made a decision that violated every piece of frontier wisdom he'd learned in 43 years of hard living. He filled a clean metal basin with fresh water and placed it near the fence post where the wolf usually appeared. Then he retreated to his porch and waited. The wolf emerged exactly as expected, but instead of heading to the distant trough, it approached the basin Gideon had prepared. The creature drank deeply, never taking its pale yellow eyes off the rancher. When finished, it took several steps toward the cabin, sat down, and simply waited. Gideon felt his pulse quicken. In all his years in these mountains, he'd never witnessed behavior like this from a wild animal. The wolf wasn't acting like predator or prey. It was acting like it needed something specific from him. The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching snow as Gideon slowly rose from his chair. His ranch was failing. The bank would likely foreclose before spring, and he had nowhere else to go. His wife Sarah had died 2 years ago, leaving him alone with memories and mounting debts. He had nothing left to lose by following his instincts. The wolf stood when Gideon moved, then began walking toward the forest with the same deliberate pace it had shown each morning. After 20 steps, it stopped and looked back, waiting. Against every rational thought in his mind, Gideon grabbed his coat and followed the injured animal into the wilderness. The wolf moved slowly due to its wound, but with unmistakable purpose through terrain Gideon had never fully explored. They climbed steadily through dense pine groves and across frozen creek beds for nearly an hour. The wolf finally stopped at the base of a towering rock formation that rose like a natural fortress from the forest floor. The animal approached a cluster of weathered boulders and disappeared behind them. When Gideon rounded the stones, he discovered what the wolf had been seeking all along: a narrow opening in the cliff face. Barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, was partially concealed by fallen branches and decades of accumulated debris. The wolf sat beside the entrance, its breathing labored, but its eyes alert. This wasn't random wandering. The animal had brought him here for a specific reason that would soon become devastatingly clear. The wolf disappeared into the cave opening, seeking shelter and probably water from an underground spring. Gideon understood now that the animal had been using this place as a refuge while recovering from its injury. What he didn't understand was why the wolf had tolerated his presence, even seemed to welcome it. He struck a match and peered into the narrow passage. The flame revealed smooth limestone walls carved by centuries of water flow. Cold air drifted from deep within the mountain, carrying the faint sound of dripping water. This wasn't just a shallow cave. It was an extensive underground system. The passage opened into a larger chamber after 20 feet of careful navigation. Gideon's match illuminated rough stone walls and a floor littered with animal bones, evidence that various creatures had used this place for shelter over many years. The wolf had settled near what appeared to be a small pool of clear water in the far corner. As he lit another match, something metallic caught his eye near the pool's edge. Half buried in decades of accumulated sediment was a corroded metal object that clearly didn't belong in a natural cave. Gideon knelt and carefully extracted what appeared to be a small iron box, sealed with wax that had somehow survived the cave's moisture. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled leather, were items that made his hands tremble. A folded piece of paper covered in handwriting, several gold coins dated 1847, and a small canvas pouch containing what felt like more coins. But it was the paper that captured his immediate attention. The document was a crude map showing the surrounding mountain region, with detailed landmarks he recognized. Someone had marked specific locations throughout the area, including one that sat directly where his ranch now stood. Written in faded ink beside that marking were the words, "Placer deposits confirmed, winter camp established, significant color in creek bed." Below the map was a brief message: "If found by others, worked these streams for 2 seasons before Indian troubles forced retreat." Gold still there, concentrated near the big bend below the falls. Cache supplies and tools in cave systems. Will return when safe. Marcus Webb, October 1847. Gideon felt his heart racing as he realized what he'd discovered. Marcus Webb had been a prospector who'd found gold deposits on what was now his property, but had been forced to abandon his work due to conflicts with local tribes. The man had hidden his supplies and documented his discoveries in this cave, probably intending to return once the danger passed. The wolf watched him quietly from beside the water pool, its injury apparently not preventing it from finding this refuge. The animal had simply been following its territorial instincts, seeking shelter in a place it knew was safe. But those instincts had led Gideon to a discovery that could save his failing ranch. As he studied the map more carefully, Gideon could identify the creek that ran through his property. According to Marcus Webb's notations, the richest deposits were located at a bend in the stream about half a mile from his cabin. The prospector had marked the spot with precise measurements from recognizable landmarks. But there was something else in the cave that Webb had mentioned. More supplies, more tools, possibly more documentation. The wolf had brought him to this central location, but Webb's message suggested there might be additional caches hidden throughout the cave system. The question was whether those supplies were still here after 73 years, and whether the gold deposits Marcus Webb had documented were still accessible. One thing was certain. His ranch property sat directly on top of proven gold-bearing ground that had been abandoned and forgotten for nearly 3/4 of a century. Gideon followed the cave passage deeper into the mountain, using Marcus Webb's crude map as a guide. The prospector had sketched the cave system with remarkable detail, marking chambers and passages with notations about what he'd stored in each location. According to the map, the main supply cache was located in a large chamber approximately 50 yards from the entrance. The tunnel branched twice before opening into the chamber Webb had described. Gideon's match revealed a space large enough to house several men comfortably, with a natural chimney that would have allowed smoke to escape. This had clearly been Webb's base camp during his prospecting seasons. Along the far wall, protected by carefully stacked stones, were the supplies Marcus Webb had cached before his forced retreat. Wooden crates contained mining tools in remarkable condition: picks, shovels, pans, and even a small sluice box designed for stream processing. Everything a prospector would need to work placer deposits efficiently, but it was the final crate that contained Webb's most valuable legacy. Wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas were detailed journals documenting 2 full seasons of prospecting work. Page after page described the process of locating and testing gold deposits throughout the mountain region, with precise measurements and yields recorded for each location. According to Webb's meticulous records, he'd discovered substantial placer deposits in the creek that ran through what was now Gideon's property. The prospector had processed over 6 pounds of gold during his second season, with the richest concentrations located at specific bends in the stream where natural rock formations created perfect settling areas for heavy gold particles. Webb's journals also revealed why he'd been forced to abandon such a profitable operation. Tensions with local Apache tribes had escalated throughout 1847, making it impossible for a lone prospector to work safely in the remote mountain locations. Rather than risk his life for gold, Webb had carefully documented everything, cached his supplies, and retreated to more settled areas with plans to return when conditions improved. Those conditions had apparently never improved enough for Webb to reclaim his discoveries. The journals ended abruptly in October 1847, with no further entries suggesting the prospector had ever returned to his mountain claims. Gideon found himself holding documentation that proved his property contained verified gold deposits worth potentially thousands of dollars. More importantly, Webb's detailed instructions would allow him to locate and work those deposits efficiently, using proven methods the prospector had refined over 2 seasons of successful mining. The wolf had retreated deeper into the chamber and was resting beside another small pool. The animal's presence made sense now. This cave system provided everything an injured creature needed for recovery: fresh water, shelter from weather, and multiple escape routes through connecting passages. As Gideon examined Webb's tools and documentation by flickering matchlight, he realized the magnitude of what he'd discovered. His failing ranch sat directly on top of proven gold-bearing ground. He possessed the tools, knowledge, and legal claim needed to work those deposits. Most importantly, he now had a realistic chance of paying his debts and saving the only home he had left. But Webb's journals contained one final piece of information that made Gideon's hands shake as he read. The prospector had processed his gold using mercury amalgamation, a technique that required specific chemicals and equipment. According to the final journal entry, Webb had buried his mercury supply and processing equipment in a sealed container somewhere within the cave system, marked with symbols carved into the stone walls. If that mercury cache still existed, Gideon would have everything needed to extract significant wealth from his property. The question was whether 73 years had destroyed Webb's final hidden resource, or whether it remained intact, waiting for someone desperate enough to follow a wounded wolf into a forgotten mountain cave. Webb's journal described the mercury cache location, using carved symbols that would be visible even decades later. According to his notes, he'd marked the hiding spot with 3 parallel lines cut deep into the limestone, positioned at chest height near a natural rock formation that resembled an eagle's head. Gideon searched the chamber methodically, running his hands along the walls while conserving his remaining matches. The wolf watched quietly from its resting spot, no longer showing signs of distress. The animal had found what it needed: shelter, water, and apparently some instinctual sense of safety in this ancient refuge. Near the chamber's eastern wall, Gideon's fingers found the carved symbols Webb had described. 3 parallel lines, still clearly defined after 7 decades, marked a section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped. Behind loose stones, carefully arranged to appear natural, was another sealed container. Webb's final cache contained everything he'd promised in his journal: a small iron flask filled with mercury, still liquid and usable, glass vials containing chemicals needed for gold amalgamation, even a compact scale for weighing precious metal, wrapped in canvas and perfectly preserved by the cave's stable temperature and low humidity. But it was the final item in the cache that made Gideon's breath catch in his throat: a leather pouch containing refined gold, the processed results of Webb's final weeks of mining before his forced retreat. Nearly 2 pounds of gleaming metal, worth more money than Gideon had seen in his entire life. Webb's accompanying note explained everything: emergency reserve for future operations. If found by others, know that this represents 1 month's work from the richest deposits. The creek holds much more for anyone with patience and proper equipment. God willing, I will return to claim what the mountains have provided. Gideon realized he was holding not just Webb's emergency reserve, but proof that the prospector's claims about gold deposits were absolutely legitimate. This wasn't speculation or hopeful thinking. This was refined gold extracted from his property, using the methods Webb had documented in his journals. The wolf struggled to its feet and moved toward the chamber entrance, apparently ready to leave its temporary refuge. The animal's injury appeared to be healing, and its behavior suggested familiarity with this territory. This cave system was probably part of the wolf's regular hunting range, a place it knew offered safety and resources when needed. As Gideon carefully repacked Webb's discoveries, his mind raced with possibilities. The gold in his hands would cover his immediate debts and provide working capital. Webb's detailed maps would guide him to the richest deposits. The tools and chemicals would allow him to process gold efficiently. Most importantly, the journals contained 2 seasons' worth of hard-learned knowledge about successful placer mining in this specific location. For the first time in 2 years, Gideon felt something other than despair about his future. His ranch wasn't failing because the land was worthless. It was failing because he'd never known what lay beneath the surface. Marcus Webb had solved that problem 73 years ago, leaving a complete guide to extracting wealth from ground that Gideon legally owned. The wolf limped toward the cave entrance, moving with purpose but without urgency. The animal had used this place exactly as nature intended, as a refuge during injury, a source of water, and a safe haven within familiar territory. Its presence had led Gideon to Webb's discoveries, but only because a wounded creature's natural instincts had guided it to the same refuge a desperate prospector had used decades earlier. As they emerged into afternoon sunlight, Gideon understood that his life had indeed changed in a single morning. Not through magic or impossible coincidence, but through the practical intersection of animal behavior, human need, and a 73-year-old cache of knowledge and resources that could transform his failing ranch into a profitable mining operation. The wolf disappeared into the pine forest, presumably returning to whatever territory it called home. Gideon headed back to his cabin, carrying Marcus Webb's legacy and the means to save everything he'd thought was lost forever. Gideon spent the rest of the afternoon studying Marcus Webb's maps and journals by lamplight in his cabin. The prospector's handwriting was precise, his measurements detailed, and his methods clearly documented. According to Webb's records, the richest placer deposits were located at a horseshoe bend in the creek, approximately 800 yards downstream from Gideon's cabin. The next morning, Gideon followed the creek with Webb's journal in hand, counting paces and identifying landmarks the prospector had noted 73 years earlier. The big granite boulder Webb had used as a reference point was still there, weathered but unmistakable. The lightning-struck pine he'd mentioned had long since fallen and rotted away, but its massive stump remained exactly where Webb had drawn it on his map. At the horseshoe bend, Gideon knelt beside the water and examined the creek bed more carefully than he'd ever done before. What he'd always seen as ordinary gravel and sand took on new significance when viewed through Webb's educated observations. The prospector had noted specific formations where gold would naturally settle, areas where the current slowed, where heavy materials would sink and accumulate over time. Using one of Webb's original gold pans, Gideon scooped sediment from the locations the journals identified as most promising. His first pan yielded nothing but disappointment and muddy water. The second produced only small stones and sand, but the third pan, filled with gravel from beneath a large submerged rock, contained something that made his heart race. Tiny specks of yellow metal glinted in the bottom of the pan as Gideon carefully washed away the lighter materials. They were small, some no larger than pinheads, but they were unmistakably gold. Webb's 73-year-old documentation had led him directly to proven deposits. Over the next several hours, Gideon worked methodically through the locations Webb had marked on his map. Each spot yielded modest amounts of gold, not the dramatic quantities he'd hoped for, but enough to confirm that Webb's records were accurate and that substantial deposits existed throughout this section of the creek. The physical work was exhausting. Gideon's back ached from crouching beside the water, his hands were numb from the cold creek, and his knees protested against the rocky ground. He understood now why Webb had documented the need for proper equipment and systematic approach. Individual panning was slow, inefficient work that would take months to produce significant results. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Gideon returned to the cave to retrieve Webb's sluice box and other equipment. The prospector had designed his tools specifically for this location, creating wooden channels and metal screens that would process much larger quantities of creek sediment than hand panning allowed. But as he transported the equipment back to his property, Gideon encountered his first serious problem. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, his closest neighbor who lived 3 miles downstream, was riding up the creek trail on horseback. The elderly woman had a reputation for sharp eyes and persistent curiosity about anything unusual happening in the area. She reined in her horse when she spotted Gideon carrying mining equipment, her weathered face showing immediate interest in his activities. Mrs. Hartwell knew every detail of local business, and she would certainly ask pointed questions about why a failing rancher was suddenly engaged in prospecting work. More problematically, she would likely share whatever she learned with other neighbors, creating exactly the kind of attention Gideon couldn't afford while trying to establish his mining operation. The success of his venture now depended not just on extracting gold from Webb's proven deposits, but on maintaining complete secrecy about his activities until he could secure his financial position and legal mining rights. Mrs. Hartwell's sharp eyes took in every detail of the mining equipment Gideon carried. Her horse shifted restlessly as she studied the wooden sluice box and metal pans with obvious recognition. As the widow of a former prospector, she knew exactly what she was seeing. Planning some creek work. "Are you Gideon?" she asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected complete honesty. "Haven't seen anyone running sluices in these parts for 20 years or more. What makes you think there's color in that water?" Gideon forced his expression to remain casual while his mind raced for a believable explanation. Mrs. Hartwell was known throughout the county for her inability to keep private information to herself. Whatever he told her would be common knowledge within a week. "Found some old equipment in one of the caves up there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains. "Thought I might try my luck, see if there's anything worth the effort. Probably just wasting my time, but figured it was worth checking." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mighty coincidental, finding prospecting gear right when the bank's breathing down your neck. Word is you've got maybe 2 months before they foreclose on this place." The truth of her statement hit Gideon like a physical blow. His financial situation was apparently common knowledge, which meant his neighbors were already watching for signs of desperation. Any significant change in his behavior would be noticed and discussed. "Just exploring options," Gideon replied carefully. "Ranch hasn't been profitable enough to cover expenses. Maybe the creek will supplement things until cattle prices improve." Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. but her expression remained skeptical. "Well, good luck to you. Though I'd be careful about working too close to the main trail. You never know who might be passing through these days. Some folks get mighty interested when they see mining activity." After she rode away, Gideon realized his situation had become significantly more complicated. He couldn't risk working the creek during daylight hours when travelers might spot his activities, but night work would be nearly impossible with the equipment and techniques Webb had documented. He spent the evening studying Webb's journals more carefully, looking for solutions to his dilemma. The prospector had faced similar challenges during his time in the mountains, working alone while avoiding detection by hostile tribes. Webb's approach had been to establish multiple small work sites, rather than one obvious operation, processing modest quantities at each location to avoid creating visible evidence of his activities. Following Webb's strategy, Gideon began working before dawn, processing creek sediment at different locations along the Horseshoe Bend. The 73-year-old sluice box worked efficiently once he'd repaired some loose boards and replaced corroded metal screening. Webb's mercury amalgamation process, described in careful detail in the journals, allowed him to extract gold particles too small for conventional panning. After 5 days of careful work, Gideon had processed nearly 200 pounds of creek sediment and recovered almost half an ounce of gold. It was enough to prove Webb's documentation was accurate, but far less than he needed to solve his financial problems. According to Webb's records, however, the richest deposits lay deeper in the creek bed, beneath layers of accumulated gravel that would require more aggressive excavation to reach. The prospector had noted that his best yields came from areas where he dug down 3 to 4 feet below the current creek bottom. But deeper excavation would create obvious evidence of mining activity, exactly what Gideon couldn't afford to risk with neighbors already watching his every move. Gideon faced an impossible choice. Webb's journals indicated the richest deposits lay 4 feet beneath the current creek bed, but excavating that deep would create obvious evidence of mining activity. With Mrs. Hartwell already suspicious, and only 7 weeks until foreclosure, he couldn't afford discovery. Yet surface panning would never yield enough gold to save his ranch. The solution came from Webb's notes about winter operations. The prospector had worked during frozen months by building temporary wooden dams to divert water flow, allowing him to dig deeper into exposed creek beds. Webb had carefully documented the construction process, including how to restore natural water flow afterward, to eliminate evidence of his work. Gideon spent 2 days cutting timber and assembling Webb's dam design upstream from the Horseshoe Bend. The structure was simple but effective, wooden planks supported by heavy stones that could divert the creek's flow around his work area, while remaining invisible from the main trail. When he opened the diversion channel, water began flowing around the bend instead of through it, gradually exposing the creek bed Webb had identified as most promising. Within hours, Gideon was working in an area that had been underwater for decades, using Webb's tools to excavate layers of accumulated gravel and sediment. The deeper he dug, the more obvious Webb's expertise became. 3 feet down, the gold content in each pan increased dramatically. 4 feet down, Gideon was recovering more gold in a single pan than he'd found during his entire week of surface work. Webb's documentation had been precise. The richest deposits were exactly where the prospector had indicated. But the excavation created another problem Gideon hadn't anticipated. The deeper hole required increasingly larger amounts of material to be moved and processed, creating growing piles of tailings that would be visible to anyone passing near the creek. More critically, the work was exhausting for a single person and far too slow for his urgent timeline. On his 3rd day of deep excavation, Gideon heard horses approaching from the direction of the main trail. He had perhaps 2 minutes to cover his activities before riders reached the creek crossing, where they would have a clear view of his operation. The diversion dam, excavation site, and equipment piles were impossible to hide in such short time. 2 men emerged from the pine forest, strangers who weren't local residents. They wore the practical clothing of traveling businessmen, rather than ranchers or prospectors, and their horses carried saddlebags that suggested a longer journey than casual local travel. One man pointed directly toward Gideon's worksite and said something to his companion that Gideon couldn't hear over the sound of rushing water. Both riders approached the creek crossing with obvious interest in the mining operation. The older man dismounted and walked to the edge of Gideon's excavation, studying the exposed creek bed and equipment with the practiced eye of someone familiar with placer mining techniques. "Productive ground?" the stranger asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as they took in every detail of the operation. Haven't seen anyone working this creek in 20 years or more. What convinced you there was color here? Gideon realized he was facing exactly the situation Webb had warned about in his journals. Traveling businessmen often included investors looking for profitable mining opportunities. If these men recognized the potential of his discoveries, they might attempt to claim the ground or force a partnership that would eliminate his chance of solving his financial problems independently. The second stranger remained mounted, but was clearly studying the tailings piles and estimating the quantity of material Gideon had processed. His expression suggested someone calculating potential profits, rather than making casual conversation about a neighbor's hopeful prospecting. Gideon made a calculated decision that would determine whether he kept control of his discovery or lost everything to experienced claim jumpers. He straightened up from his excavation and met the older stranger's gaze directly, projecting confidence rather than the desperate anxiety he felt. "Ground's been disappointing, to be honest," Gideon said, gesturing toward his modest pile of processed material. "Found enough color to keep me interested, but nothing that would justify serious investment. Mostly just keeping busy while I figure out what to do about the ranch." The stranger's eyes narrowed as he studied Gideon's expression for signs of deception. "Mind if I take a look at what you've recovered? 20 years of prospecting teaches you to recognize productive ground pretty quickly." Gideon reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small leather pouch containing perhaps a 1/4 ounce of gold, a fraction of what he'd actually recovered over the past week. The visible amount was enough to explain his continued work, but not enough to suggest significant deposits. "About what I'd expect from marginal ground," the stranger said after examining the gold. "Might be worth working if you had nothing better to do, but I wouldn't recommend anyone investing serious money here." He handed the pouch back to Gideon and remounted his horse. "Good luck with your ranch troubles." After the riders disappeared downstream, Gideon resumed his excavation with desperate urgency. He had perhaps 2 more days before other travelers might pass through, and he needed to extract as much gold as possible before dismantling his operation completely. Working from dawn until dark, Gideon processed the richest section of creekbed Webb had identified in his journals. The prospector's 73-year-old documentation proved remarkably accurate. The deepest deposits yielded more gold than Gideon had dared hope. By the end of his second day, he had recovered nearly 12 ounces of refined gold, worth more than enough to satisfy his creditors and maintain ownership of his property. On the final morning, Gideon dismantled Webb's diversion dam and carefully restored natural water flow to the creek. Following the prospector's detailed instructions, he scattered his tailings downstream and replanted disturbed vegetation to eliminate obvious evidence of mining activity. Within hours, the horseshoe bend appeared much as it had before his excavation began. 3 weeks later, Gideon walked into the territorial bank in town, carrying a leather satchel containing refined gold worth $1,800. The bank president's expression shifted from skeptical dismissal to surprised attention as Gideon placed the precious metal on his desk and requested payoff figures for his outstanding loans. "Mr. Pratt, this is quite unexpected," the banker said, weighing the gold carefully. "May I ask where you acquired such a substantial amount of refined metal?" "Prospecting work on my property," Gideon replied truthfully. "Found some old equipment and decided to test the creek. Turned out more productive than expected." The banker completed his calculations and prepared the necessary paperwork to clear Gideon's debts. After paying off his loans, Gideon retained nearly $600 in working capital, enough to restock his ranch, repair buildings, and operate independently for at least 2 years. 6 months later, Gideon's property was thriving. His cattle operation had expanded, his buildings were repaired, and he'd established himself as one of the county's more prosperous ranchers. Nobody questioned his sudden financial recovery, assuming he'd simply made successful investments or received an inheritance. Webb's journals remained hidden in the cave, along with the prospector's tools and remaining supplies. Gideon visited the site occasionally, but he never resumed mining operations. The 12 ounces of gold had been enough to transform his life completely. Marcus Webb's 73-year-old legacy had fulfilled its purpose, saving a desperate man's future through careful documentation, proven techniques, and the unlikely guidance of a wounded wolf seeking shelter in an ancient mountain refuge. The gray wolf occasionally appeared near his water trough, apparently fully recovered from its injury and resuming its normal territorial range. Gideon always left fresh water in the metal basin, remembering the morning that had changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable story where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.